This is Coder Radio, episode 373 for September 2nd, 2019. Hello, and welcome to Coder Radio, Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly talk show that takes a pragmatic look at the art and business of software development and related technologies. My name is Wes, and I'm pleased to be joined by Mr. Michael Dominic. Welcome back to the show, Mike.
Hello, Mr. Payne.
You know, I'm very glad to have you here down there in Florida as a hurricane approaches, so we better make this a quick one today and let you get back to prepping.
That's right, we're battening down the hatches and we are making sure our programs are memory safe because Dorian is coming.
Now, let's get things rolling with some feedback. We've got a letter in from our pal Joseph asking about getting started on .NET. Hello. At my job as a system administrator, I tend to interact with a lot of developers pushing out new content to websites. We are primarily a Microsoft shop focusing on .NET development on Windows servers. My question is, what's the easiest route to get started? When I started looking online, there are so many different language choices out there. C#, F#, ASP. In your experience, what's the easiest way to get started? And Mike, this just screamed Mike question to me because, you know, you've been down this road. And we've talked a bit about .NET development, of course. But what about this person, someone maybe familiar with the operational side of things, but not so much the programming side? Where would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of a two-parter, right? For the language, as much as I would love to tell you to look at F#, the truth is there are just so many more resources for learning in C#, and it basically is the lingua franca of the Microsoft world. Now, in terms of educational resources, if you were doing Azure, I would definitely recommend you check out our Linux Academy plug course. But since you said you're doing Windows Server, which I'm guessing means on-prem, actually check out MSDN's Channel 9. It used to be channel9.msdn.com. I think it's now just Channel 9. So if you go ahead and Bing that, since we're talking Microsoft, you'll find it. They have a lot of tutorial videos. There's also a MSDN developer, and I think this is actually now called Visual Studio Developer, YouTube channel that is really good. There's specific sub-channels for Xamarin, and for .NET Core in particular has a very active YouTube channel. These are all great free resources. I would maybe start with Channel 9 and then go over to YouTube. But you'll find it. Microsoft and even the .NET Foundation have really gone out of their way, or at least members of that community have gone out of their way to, make onboarding resources readily available, particularly for .NET Core. So if you're thinking of transitioning, I know you didn't mention that, but just, as .NET Core is becoming the standard above regular .NET for server-side applications, I have to guess that that's somewhere on your radar.
Oh yeah, that's a good point, right? If you're thinking about the future, you should probably be thinking about .NET Core. All right, well, that's some good advice. If anyone else has some feedback or maybe some tips on how they got started in .NET, well, you can send that our way over at coder.show/contact. Now, Mike, our next bit of feedback has some opinions about Rust.
Yeah, this was a great email from, this is a direct quote, a fellow hacker man. I am not going to read the whole thing just because we're on a time constraint today, but I think there's one section that's particularly interesting. So, quote, the primary issue here being with Rust's approach to memory safety is that most of the work to prove that safety beyond trust me blocks is pushed onto the developer instead of having the compiler insert protections surmised from uses of the data structures outlined in the news source. The second part, after all, it can only prove what it is shown and not what it assumes. So this is interesting, right? And we're getting deep into the whole, the most common issues in production applications tend to be memory safety type issues, right?
Yeah, we've talked about that a bit in the past. There's more and more research finding that those are a substantial problem in real code bases out there.
Yeah, in fact, our fellow hacker man actually goes on to recommend a paper, The Meaning of Memory Safety, by Arthur Azevedo de Amorim. If I butchered that name, I do apologize, which is basically a comp sci paper that has a different approach to memory safety. But this is becoming I guess I would say this is becoming a consensus in the industry, both on the academic side and the more practitioner side, that most common issues are memory issues. Now, the author seems to be suggesting that Rust is making the user do a little too much work to get that benefit. That's interesting, right? Especially when I look at the rest of his email and he talks about what would a language that didn't put that on you look like. I have a feeling that our fellow hacker man is basically correct, that what Rust makes you enforce yourself via the compiler, in 5-10 years, there's going to be some either new version of Rust or just new language completely that, I hate to use it, but uses some like machine learning or whatever, right, to do exactly what he says and just infer the right kind of protections without you having to explicitly, go through and do all the kind of guardrail stuff. We're not there yet, though, right? I mean, it's interesting because this whole idea of your tooling be able to infer what you want, like that's the whole push on Visual Studio 2019,
right?
That they're having IntelliSense is not being powered by AI.
Oh boy, that's a little buzzword soup right there. IntelliSense AI.
I'm not sure I completely buy that, but yeah, I think this is where we're going, right? Because it just makes sense if this issue is so big that it's the widest surface area for production issues, then absolutely. We shouldn't have to do it by hand, and yeah, our tooling should do it. Whether that tooling is at the editor or the language level, I think that's going to be an open debate going forward. But I just don't think we're there yet. So again, a fellow hacker man, I agree with you for the most part. I think the time scale is going to be 5 to 10 years on this.
It just makes me think, he links to, as highly recommended reading, a paper titled The Meaning of Memory Safety, which sort of explores, a rigorous definition of what it means to be memory safe and uses, some theorem-proving based languages to sort of go build a language on top of that. And that's an interesting idea. And I think it's important that, it's great that we have Rust. It's awesome that we're normalizing some of these things, adding these abilities, making developers familiar with this, but it's by no means the end goal, right? We are not yet at a time where things like formal methods are widely used. That's picking up. I think that's changing, but there's this, we have a long way to go.
Well, I would also take this a step more meta here and say there is no end goal, right? What we think is amazing today is going to be garbage to the next generation of developer, and what they think is amazing will be garbage to their quote unquote descendants, right? I think this is, I'll use another buzzword since I'm playing bingo today, a situation of continuous improvement, right? We're always going to be making our tools better. Languages are always going to help us solve these problems more. And yeah, it is true, and this is coming from an objective C level, that we have gained a lot, I would say, in the last 15 years. And yeah, into the next 15 years, we're going to gain more, and it's going to be great, and we should all be happy.
Well said. All right, well, our next bit of feedback is someone who's not so happy with you, Mike.
How unusual.
Right, that's never happened before. This is all after you expressed some opinions about macros last episode, 372, Crystal Clear. Now, over in our Coder Radio subreddit, coderradio.reddit.com, Code Sections writes, Mike, I'm not sure how to break this to you, but Rust very much has macros. And, I'm mostly joking, but it sounded a lot like you were contrasting Crystal and Rust and saying that you didn't like that Crystal has macros. Now, really, I'd just love to hear more about why you dislike macros. Personally, I view Rust macro system as one of its biggest selling points. I've written more than a few myself, and every time they've simplified my code in ways I couldn't have managed without them.
Ooh, so this is a big question, right? So there's a few pieces of this. Yes, I'm aware that Rust has macros. I can't say that I've never used them, right? Which is, I thought what I said last week. I have, in fact, done some macros and other bad stuff. You have to remember, though, I'm coming from a position of having a lot of Ruby experience, where what we would call macros in other languages, and and I know this is kind of this is actually not an unfair comparison, but like monkey patching was a real problem for a long time in Ruby. So the reason I didn't like the way Crystal presented macros, maybe we should just back up a little bit, is that I thought they were overemphasizing it in the way it's presented. It's making it seem like it's something you should do all the time.
Okay.
It is just my belief, because I think the truth is there's multiple things you could be doing here, right? I think that should really be a tool in your tool chest. Like I said, I use it, but that's not the first thing you go to. And I can tell you, coming from the Ruby world, features like this have been overused and have wreaked havoc on production code bases. No, I don't think I ever said thou shalt not use macros, but I don't think you should think of it first, right? I definitely feel like it is a dangerous feature, I guess is what I'm getting at, right? It's the jigsaw in a wood shop. I don't know if you've ever, done any woodworking, but it is a pretty powerful, pretty precise tool that you can do a lot of cool stuff with. It's also one of the tools that people most often get injured with.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be said for that, right? It can be very useful to have in a language and can allow a lot of experimentation or DSLs or clean up better, more expressive APIs. But you're right, it's something you reach for only when that's the only thing that will do. And after you've already learned the language, learned to, sort of work within the boundaries, much like with writing anything, right? You got to learn the rules before you can bend them. Yeah,
and I would say like my biggest kind of hiccup with how macros were presented in the Crystal documentation and the various guides I read was that they were presented very early, which I guess you could say someone looking at Crystal in 2019 is probably already an experienced developer, so you should trust them. I don't, right? It's just my opinion that that's the kind of feature you ought not use unless you've really, really have a good reason. Which again is an opinion. And, I have seen beautiful Rust macros. I have written Rust macros that made my life easier, right? Wes, you made a good point. It makes your code cleaner because sometimes you just need to do something and like not using a macro would be spaghetti.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe you have to repeat yourself a whole bunch because the language you're using doesn't sort of let you extend in a natural way in some area, and you can sort of templatize that with macros.
Yeah, it's weird, and I think there's some overloading of terms here too, because like their macro, we're going to get way too deep into language specifics on Ruby, but people have justified very bad practices in the Ruby community by calling them the equivalent of macros. And we can end up in this weird philosophical debate about like, what is a macro? I will concede the point to the Redditor that I am maybe overly conservative on this point, but not necessarily completely wrong.
Right. No, it's an interesting discussion. And you're right, like in Ruby, things can go wrong. And you do have to be careful when you're changing the way things work. You're breaking a lot of assumptions people have, and it better be clear what's happening. I think none of us like to be the developer that gets put in a new code base and there's all this weird magic and non-standard stuff going on, and it takes forever to get up to speed as a result.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, in West, I think you actually made my point better than I did. My whole thing is I'm always thinking of, I have been the developer who picks up the project after 5 years, and I'm also like often, because people don't want to hire contractors or consultants forever, in some cases. So, I am sometimes turning over code bases, particularly when I work with smaller companies that like I've worked on for 6 months or a year, and their internal people are going to do. And if I have a bunch of I like your term, non-standard behavior in there, well, that's going to be a nightmare for the next person. And I really don't like giving people nightmares, other than you and Chris.
Yeah, well, you're good at that.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say a little thank you to Wasa B over on our subreddit too, who pointed out we missed a link. Mike, you'd recommended the Imposter's Handbook as a guide for self-taught programmers, which I think is a great reference. So sorry about that. I've added it to the show notes, and we'll have it in this show as well, because why not?
Yep, that was my bad. Sorry, guys. So, Wes, I have an advertising opportunity I'd like to discuss.
Oh, tell me more, Mike.
We have ads on our phones. We have ads in our browsers. We have billboards in the real world. But how about some ads in Terminal?
Oh, boy. Well, I've got some bad news for you then, Mike, because...
Oh, no.
Yeah. According to NPM Inc., the company that runs, NPM, the popular JavaScript packaging tool, well... they've taken a new stance and plan to ban exactly that behavior.
I have never been more happy about unilateral action in my life.
this all came up as we talked about last week, right? As Standard, a popular JavaScript library, started showing ads in the terminal after being installed. The ads were actually being shown via another package called Funding that was included in Standard's code base. And, they're both developed by the same developer, and he was just trying to seek a way to sort of alleviate costs for running the project. The JavaScript community didn't really react the way that he expected and has just mostly been criticized, especially for people who started finding these ads polluting their production logs. And, that makes people rather unhappy. It also saw someone else create the first ever, at least to our knowledge, terminal ad blocker. So that's pretty entertaining too.
We truly live in a fallen world.
So NPM's new rules, they're basically going to ban packages that display ads at runtime, on installation, or at other stages of the software development lifecycle. Packages with code that can be used to display ads, those are fine, but packages themselves cannot display ads. Packages that themselves function primarily as ads, with only placeholder or negligible code data or other technical content. So those will also be banned. What do you think of this? I mean, no one really wants ads in their terminal, but we've brought up many times, funding is hard for independent developers.
Yeah, but no. Something feels very wrong to me about polluting people's production logs with ads. I think just like we should all have a coder radio agreement here and not do this.
I've also seen, it makes me think of some other programs. One that comes to mind is the GNU Parallel, which is kind of like Xargs, but on steroids. And they display a little banner sort of talking about how the software is development and showing how to cite them unless you pass an explicit flag each time. Yeah, so I don't know if there's room here or not, but it's interesting. And, if you've got JavaScript packages, well, watch out for these new rules.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it does go to the story we talked about last week about how many of these open source maintainers of vital packages are basically, doing this work for a subsistence or less, which is bad. But this is probably not the way to get funding.
Right. And I mean, I guess as we saw in this case, it didn't really work out and mostly got a negative reaction. So ideals aside, doesn't seem to work well in practice. All right, well, here's another story to get upset about. And really, it's not new, but we both noticed people had just sort of picked it up again. It had been floating around on a lot of the aggregator sites. And that's the news back from June originally, that Apple wants to remove scripting languages from Mac OS. Xcode 11 Beta 7 release notes state, scripting language runtimes such as Python, Ruby, and Perl are included in Mac OS for compatibility with legacy software. In future versions, scripting language runtimes won't be available by default and may require you to install an additional package. If your software depends on scripting languages, it's recommended that you bundle the runtime within the app. Now, first things first, what do you think about the term scripting language, Mike? They're talking about your beloved Ruby here. It's not something you develop applications with.
Yeah, I saw there was quite a bit of fervor here on, what do you mean scripting language? I don't know that I care. I mean, all they had to say was interpreted language, right? They would have dodged the entire controversy. But yeah, I mean, scripting, kind of use scripting and interpreted to be the same thing. I know it's wrong, but I don't know what a scripting language would be today. Is it PowerShell script, right? Bash script?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess those are things you can write that the language makes it easy to write short little programs, and maybe you can use in an interactive way. I don't know if that's required or not, but I certainly like those.
So this might be a nothing burger, right? If the package that you get Ruby, Python, and Perl in is just something, it's one of those things on Mac where you type in I think if you type in Java C now, it brings up you need to install Java.
Yeah.
If it's just something like that, where if you type in Ruby and it's would you like to download the Ruby package? That's fine. But kind of the key issue here is that the Mac package manager Homebrew, which is not official because Apple doesn't like package managers for some reason, requires you to have Ruby, and it assumes because all Macs up until today have had Ruby on them. I mean, of course, there's the trolley, come to Linux, guys. Fair enough. But it seems weird, and I don't quite understand why they're doing this. I mean, I get that you want to do as little work as possible, but, Macs used to be pitched themselves as like, this is the developer workstation. And while they never did a great job at keeping their versions of these scripting environments these interpreted languages updated, it was nice that there was a version by default.
Some people I've seen speculating, that this is moved just to try to push people more onto their own language runtimes.
Wow, but people doing things, particularly in like Perl, are not going to go to Swift.
Okay, fair enough.
Right, like all of these Perl, Python, and Ruby, you're going to switch to Swift? Really? Like I could see someone saying, geez, I'm so annoyed with Perl, I'm going to go to Ruby or Python. Yeah, that's the thing that happens, right? Many Ruby developers were or are Perl developers. And there's constant bleeding between Python and Ruby. But I don't think anyone's going to Swift from these. Like, I don't understand why this would be done other than saving time.
Yeah, I mean, is it just a simplicity play, I mean, they weren't really updating them anyway. And there is already culture, as you noted, right? Like Apple doesn't care for package manager. So there's already this culture of like installing their bundled style of applications, or maybe just even, getting it from the store.
Well, they did this with Java when Oracle changed the license. So I'm not wondering.
Right.
Like that's the reason they're going to fish cell instead of bash is the GPL3. So I couldn't find concrete proof, but it's either like laziness, but Apple actually does like try to do a good job. I almost wonder, is there some licensing thing that they're afraid of? The reality of the situation is what's going to happen. Okay, the homebrew community is going to come together and fix this. And I bet they're going to keep, like, you should, first of all, do not bundle the runtime with your packages. That's bad. Don't do that. You don't need to make your applications, your package, your little whatever one-off command line program super big.
What about when you need libraries, though? So what this had me all thinking about, it just made me start thinking about, like, does that just mean that these tools, we talked about the Pi Oxidizer project, for example, and in the which is a tool to sort of bundle Python apps. And in the launching blog post, the author writes, Python hasn't ever had a consistent story for how I give my code to someone else, especially if that someone else isn't a developer and just wants to use my application. So, like, can you rely on whatever random runtime? If you also need to install libraries, you need to make sure that those work. Maybe some of those libraries require a certain version of the runtime.
So, I mean, just because that's what I know best, in the Ruby world, you can put like a .ruby version in whatever you're distributing, and it will warn the user if they don't have the right version of Ruby, right?
Right, but then doesn't that just mean you're like, whatever the person you're trying to sell your nice little app to has to go figure out how they install Ruby?
So now we're getting into dark sides of sandboxing here too, though, right? All right, so there's two ways to approach this problem. What Apple seems to be suggesting is that everything becomes like Docker, where when I distribute my application to you, I'm giving you the environment that I built it on.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or whatever environment you want it to run in.
That's how Mac apps tend to work. If you've actually ever, like there are system libraries that, because Apple controls everything, they know they are. Like, yeah, anything else, you are distributing the libraries for your application. My hiccup here is they specifically use the word scripting. So I don't think, I could be wrong because, they're never going to confirm or deny until they do it. But I don't think they mean like using one of those weird, like, GUI things that lets you write GUI apps in Python or Ruby. I don't think that's like what they're talking about here. I don't think that we're talking about things that end in .app, where you launch them on your Mac through Aqua. I think they literally mean like configuration scripts and command line applications, in which case distributing the entire runtime seems a little silly to me. You certainly can do it.
Well, there is the other point, as you say, right? Like, having a default runtime doesn't mean that you can't distribute your own.
All right, I have like 7 versions of Ruby on my Mac. This is a solved problem. And maybe that's Apple's point. The only people using these languages are developers. And like adding one more step to set up your dev machine to save them a ton of time doing this. Maybe that's all it is, right? We might be overthinking it. It might just be they don't want to do the work anymore. They know developers will just, download the languages and the runtimes and be good to go. I don't know. This is the kind of thing, though, I wish they would be more transparent on, because this actually affects people's livelihoods.
Right, and maybe it makes you question, too, like, is this going to keep working as a platform for me to work on?
Right. Is it just going to be another paper cut of like, okay, this is yet another thing that I have to accommodate because Mac is weird?
It did make me kind of curious, aside from the Mac part of this whole thing. I was thinking about this problem on my own as well, because I sometimes have, people I work with that I want to distribute things to, or friends, maybe a tool I could craft for them. And they're not always developers. No, they're computer literate, let's say, but not sophisticated. Have you had to package Ruby apps before? Because I did some searching around. I saw Traveling Ruby, which was from the Fusion folks, although it doesn't seem to have been updated since 2018. And then I also found a project called Ruby Packer. Have you used anything like that?
So most of the command line Ruby apps I use, we're using internally, and we all standardize on certain versions of Ruby, or they're Rails apps, and I deploy them, myself to the server.
Even in the Linux world, things are moving a little bit this way too, right? I mean, we've seen more and more, but just regular containers, Docker containers, but then also things like snap packages and Flatpak and app image, also environments where you can ship a whole bunch of libraries if you want to.
Yeah, which might be the way we're going, right? This might just be an industry trend that Apple is kind of catching up to.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know. We should all be running Gen 2.
Maybe we should. This whole thing has just been making me think, though, about, what is a scripting environment and, what makes that different? And we've got shells, like you mentioned, like you're a fish shell fan too, right, Mike? And I know Chris and I both like it as well, but even just Bash is a rich environment. It's a way to sort of, you do, you interact. It, you send a query, the computer responds, and you repeat that cycle. And I remember this good blog article by Michael Fogus, who is he's done all kinds of a prolific programmer, let's say, and has happened to be a co-author of one of my favorite books for learning Clojure, which is The Joy of Clojure. But back in April, he had an article titled "Notes on Interactive Computing Environments," and kind of reviews some interesting highlights from computer history about things. Things like Smalltalk and Forth and environments we've talked about. But I just like this quote that he highlights: "Your programming environments should be an active partner in the act of creating systems." And I just thought that, kind of ties in with the way that you interact with scripting languages. It ties into the way you interact with maybe a rich IDE on a statically typed language, stuff we were talking about at the start of the show with Rust and whatever the future might be.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I definitely like the interactive Ruby mode.
Or it makes me think of Emacs as well, which is another example he cites, right? Emacs is so extensible, and it has its own little language you can use, so you can build it. And people who use it well, right? They use it for code, they use it to edit text, they use it to make blogs, they use it for programming, for to-do lists, for source control management, and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? I mean, you can boot up into it. The other interesting thing, you mentioned this at the start, is woodworking. And there's a great talk by a programmer named Tim Ewald about programming with hand tools. And it's all about sort of the joy of working with hand tools and having simple pieces that you can sort of, add together and understand. And, your example from earlier, when you have a powerful piece of construction equipment, well, it is very useful, but it also means you can hurt yourself. And oftentimes you can really get by with simpler but interactive tooling.
Like Objective-C.
Well, I mean, it was just making me think even of, just being in the shell and using tools there and how many affordances we have. So in the show notes, we'll also have a link to a recent article, Things You Didn't Know About GNU Readline. Because, I mean, Readline is an awesome little software library. It lets you do so much. And, you can actually hook into it yourself. You get all that goodness. It used to be actually a part of the bash shell intrinsically, but has obviously been sort of refactored out. And now you can use it if you want to make your own sort of command line interactive application. Which also got me thinking, why don't we expect better from our command line environments? I wonder if we've been a bit distracted by, developments in sort of richer IDEs. And so it's now just the sort of especially nerdy, maybe more Unix-focused person who cobbles together their IDE from, a text editor and some scripts and stuff, and the majority have moved on.
Well, I would push back a little bit, right? Like with the new Windows terminal, I think you were definitely right for quite a long time, but I think people are moving back. I can tell you in the early aughts, like the big thing was Vim, right? Like you had to, you ran a Mac and you knew Vim. You had to use Vim, right? Especially if you were doing Ruby. It was like all the hotness. Thoughtbot used to do all these conferences on it. They used to post all this crap about Vim. I think now in a lot of ways, VS Code is kind of taking that mantle, which is weird because it's not by any stretch a command line tool. But I'm seeing a lot of people modding it and like kind of going full, Emacs beard with their VS Code environment. I mean, are we going to go back to the glory days of Emacs v Vim? Probably not. But I think a lot of people are using these tools still. And I actually think one of the interesting things about Catalina, the new version of macOS coming out, is that it's defaulting to fish cell, which is going to get a lot more people using fish cell overnight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just by default, Fish is doing more. Like you can tune and tweak Bash to do a lot of neat stuff, but Fish has a lot of those sort of stuff on by default.
Out of the box.
And so you're suddenly like, oh, like it's like auto-completing and offering me suggestions, and it's bright and happy and colorful.
I often think that like the big IDEs are easy for people to get started with because they tend to have wizards and kind of like step-by-step setups for, setting up toolchain, which can be challenging when you're new. But as you get more experience, the IDE can feel like a prison. That's not always true, right? Like if you're doing .NET, it really is hard to find an environment for .NET that is better than Visual Studio on Windows. But particularly if you're doing these quote-unquote scripting languages, Python, Ruby, like I like RubyMine, I like PyCharm. But yeah, I mean, every once in a while I'll just do it in Vim.
Yeah. I mean, you just ever open up IRB and sort of poke around for a little bit?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah. Okay, so that's where it gets back. You're right. IDEs can be like a good get up to speed. They can do hide a lot of the stuff you don't need to worry about as a beginner. But I think the opposite can be true too, right? Because there's like so many knobs and buttons and preferences, and it might depend if you're inheriting an existing project versus just playing around. Because I think if we had better, commonly used sorts of like REPLs and interactive command lines, that might just be a great way. Because I love that when I'm trying out a new language, if I can just start up a session and sort of play, have a conversation back and forth. And so I've been recently, having been spoiled by Clojure, there's been a recent it's called rebel-readline, which is it's a REPL but using GNU readline that has a rich sort of, it does syntax highlighting and autocomplete stuff, and it'll indent and format all your code for you. So I kind of went hunting around for other languages I use, which led me to BPython, which is just like a simple, it's not as fancy and complicated as like IPython, Jupyter Notebook style stuff, but it's just a fancy curses interface to Python. And so you get lots of nice stuff like colors and tab complete and, sort of help you explore around like you're used to in, IntelliSense style in an IDE, but like just right there on the command line. I've also, in my personal development, when I've been doing Ruby, I've been playing with Pry a lot, and it is awesome. It's about the best thing outside of the Clojure world in like an interactive REPL I've been able to find. Have you used it ever?
I have not. What is that?
It's a Ruby REPL. Well, really, they call it a runtime developer console and IRB alternative with powerful introspection capabilities. And it is neat. So in the Clojure world, one of the unique things you do in the way you interact with it, right, is you go write some code in your editor, and then when you finish that little form, you finish the new function or the changes to the function that you're working on or whatever, you go hit a command, and then that sends it over the wire, and it gets evaluated in your running environment. And while I don't quite have that sort of like networked, at a distance with Pry at the moment, you can like do everything in it. So you can ask it to like, you want to make a change, you tell it you want to edit a file. It'll pull up that file in your editor, and then when you've saved it, it'll then go reload that file for you, and then you can go futz around and play with it more.
Interesting.
I learned about it first when, because another way you can use it is if you load it in an application you're developing, it's got like a binding you can call, and then it just loads an interactive debugger right there, and then you have a REPL at that breakpoint that you can, investigate all the state.
That is pretty cool, actually, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Look at you dipping into Ruby, by the way.
I know. Well, it turns out that there's like a lot of libraries for it and tools based around it, so.
Turns out.
So sometimes the network effect is very real.
Admit it, you love it.
Now, okay, so totally independent of that little train of thought, I also had, before I'd put that in the doc, I'd already added this little pick, which is maybe our final little segment for today, and that's Lite CLI, which is a CLI for SQLite databases with auto-completion and syntax highlighting. And I just thought that's great, too.
So what does it exactly do?
So if you go pop over to their GitHub page, they've got some nice little demos and GIFs showing you stuff. And, if you've ever had to go investigate a little database without maybe knowing the schemas that are involved, it just presents you a nice little interface to go poke around with. So you can, go view the tables, and it'll sort of autocomplete what the rows and columns are for you. And I love tools like that. Whenever you're in a new environment, you're not familiar with everything that's going on, anything that can help me get my hooks in, find the threads that you need to pull to actually understand what's happening in this program, I love it every time. Now, if you've got a favorite command line interactive application or REPL or shell of any kind, well, I would certainly love to hear about it, and you can let us know over at coder.show/contact. Coder.show also has our whole Coder Radio back catalog, and there's a lot of good stuff over there. If even that's not enough, well, head on over to jupiterbroadcasting.com, where you'll find all the other fine Jupiter Broadcasting shows. And if you haven't heard yet, well, we've got a new show in the works. That's right, self-hosted. And it's going to be coming out real soon, so you might want to go check out selfhosted.show and get subscribed right away. Now, if you'd like a little bit more Michael Dominic, and why wouldn't you? You can find him over on Twitter. Mike, you're
At Jimanuko.
I'm there too. I'm at Wes Payne. And of course, the Jupiter Network's there at Jupiter Signal. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you right back here next week.